After finishing the initial work on the windows and openings last week, the building team have moved on to another site for a brief period, which means that for the first time in nearly 5 months, I'm back to working at the house mostly on my own. Although Rex is due to provide some help one morning, a rented machine should be a big help, and another smaller friend might also be making a visit, which should all be useful for the work I want to do, not least a major tidy up indoors of all the mess we managed to create in recent weeks. On the first day of the week, I was all set to get started with the tidying up. And with no one else to open up for, I was able to arrive slightly later than I have been recently, to a beautiful sunny morning after the rain of last week and parts of the weekend. Although there was still some mist in the hills that in places looked more like steam. Our first task was to retrieve some buckets left outside in the rain. Then I headed upstairs to remind myself of what state we had left the house in when we had to leave quickly last Friday. Next, I opened up the windows to get in some light and breeze to blow out any moisture. With the window covers off, it was time to get started with the clearing up, working my way from one space to the next. With my main plan being to get most of the materials and loose items into the extension area to make it easier to remove various piles of rubble later on. Another reason for clearing these last 3 rooms is to get them cleared so that we can more easily set things up for work on the roof in this area in a few weeks' time. With the initial upstairs tidying done, it was time for a coffee in the sun. I then moved on to the scaffolding at the front, which I wanted to take down for a couple of reasons, one of which was to enable me to see the end results of the window work more clearly. With the scaffolding down, I then wanted to take the covers off the two newer windows. First downstairs at the front, and then in the room above. With the general mess in the lower front room, it was now time for some downstairs tidying up. And then a bit of lunch outside before some rain arrived. I was then back to picking stones out of rubble and removing some of the less useful waste. Tony the Technico was back on site, and we spent a fair amount of the afternoon discussing various work plans. Before I closed up, and headed out for the day. Day 2 started with another beautiful sunny morning, but the forecast was for a cloudier day later on, and my plan was to continue the tidying up work with a particular focus on the rubble created by window work over the last 2 weeks. As I opened up, my first help of the week arrived, with Rex kindly being back for the morning and getting straight to work in the middle room, where we wanted to clear various things and reorganise some of the better stones that we will be needing for some final indoor stonework in the coming weeks. Got 'em, yeah. Having freed up some space, we had more room for working with the laser level and for marking a couple of key levels along all the concrete underpinnings, which I'll be referring to for work on the downstairs floor in the coming weeks, as well as later in the day when I was going to be spreading out rubble. After finishing the middle room, we moved on to the front room. Then we had a brief break outside in front of the view.
There was a little place to pull up. It was right before you get to that gravel road that goes to Quartz.
Before heading back to mark up the back room. Rex then left me to it, and I started the rubble smoothing work in the front room. Then it was upstairs for removing the rubble piles from the window work, which, having already removed the bigger, better stones, was made up of smaller stones, mortar, and some bits of brick, and that I was going to be spreading out downstairs rather than throwing outside. After finishing the first room, it was time for a lunch break. And a short walk down the hill to check on the tent. Then I was back inside and spreading the rubble before heading back upstairs. With the rubble upstairs cleared and relocated, that was it for the day. On day 3, there were various things I needed to do off-site, so I was only going to be at the house briefly, which made it a good time for a visit from Billy, which a few people have been asking for. While I opened up, Billy had a quick look at some of the changes, stood guard briefly at the door, and then followed my work as I returned to the rubble on the floor, where for an hour or so I was going to smooth out the stones before some bigger work that I had scheduled for the next day. All of this work in the 3 vaulted rooms is in preparation for getting the final base layers in place for the floors, the bottom layer of which will be compacted rubble on top of the bedrock below. To avoid having to take everything out of the house, I'm going to split this work in half, starting with these 3 rooms where there won't be any drains under the base layers, unlike on the extension side of the house. At lunchtime, Billy got his food first, although he was more interested in the chicken on my plate than the chicken in his bowl. After lunch, Billy got the walk he had been waiting for. Then I was briefly back to smoothing the rubble in front room. Before heading out for some supplies and to get a haircut. On day 4, I was back to being on my own at the house, although I was going to be getting some help. And after I opened up, I headed back to the car to pick up the help. This is a compactor or rammer that I've rented for the day to compress the gravel layer in the 3 ground floor rooms where I want to be doing some work on the floor. It's not a sponsored or paid for product, but I thought you'd appreciate knowing a little bit about it before I start using it. It is a cordless battery powered unit, so I won't have a cable flapping around and I won't be filling the house up with fumes like it would if it was a gas engine powered machine. And the final note is that the manufacturer's name is Wacker Newson, which I quite like the idea of, to use a rammer from Wacker to compress the floor. So let's see how it goes. Well, first impressions are very positive. This is certainly pretty easy to use, especially after you get a sense of how to balance and control its movement. It's a very quiet machine, but when the rocks are breaking in a vaulted room, there is quite a lot of noise, so I think I will need to get the ear protectors on. I had 2 batteries for the machine and each one was lasting just over an hour when full, so when one became empty I needed to recharge it using the generator. Another change I made during the mid-morning break was to start dampening the floors before I started compacting them so as to reduce the amount of dust. Before my work in the middle room, I started with some water spraying. And then decided that it would be much better to move the ladders out of the way rather than try to work around them. Although that was a little tricky on my own, and I didn't manage to record my work lifting the plank back up. At lunchtime, I headed to the back to avoid sitting next to the generator that was recharging the batteries. And after some food, I returned for some final compacting. With the last battery empty and the floors well flattened, I called it a day and headed out to return the rammer from Wacker. The last day of the week was mostly going to be about this room and my efforts to tidy and reorganize it. and after my opening up routine, I headed back down to get started. As you can see from these clips, this area has been a bit of a dumping ground, especially after we bought more things indoors at the end of last week. With one side slightly clearer, it was time for a break. And then I was back in for the other side and the room at the back. After lunch, it was time for a final tidy upstairs. And a reorganization of my office. And that is the end of work for this week, which I appreciate with its focus on tidying up the mess from the last few weeks has been a little less interesting than some of the more recent videos. But it has helped me get ready for some of the next phases of work, including the second half of the roof, during which this whole area will probably be used for a whole lot of materials. While the 3 rooms on this side will likely all be filled with scaffolding as we work up above. But before that starts, we will need to do some more repair work on this wall, and we will have to work out the best solutions for scaffolding and ladders in this old stairs area. But before that, we will probably do the next work on the floors in these 3 rooms, which for the first time in months do not have a rough rubble surface. While this side of the house is now once again full of stuff, but at least it's a bit more organised and a lot easier to walk through. And next week there is due to be some fairly dramatic tidying up here outside, so long as some help arrives when it is scheduled. So please do tune again in next week to see how we get on.